While my husband lay unconscious after a devastating stroke, his son spread vicious rumors that I was having an affair with the family attorney. He secretly hired someone to photograph me leaving a hotel, then manipulated the image until everyone believed I was betraying my dying husband. But what he didn't know was that late one night, a mysterious doctor came to me, placed a recording in my hands, and whispered he thought no one in that hospital room could hear him. The moment I pressed play, I realized the lies were only the beginning of something far more dangerous. If you made it here, thank you. Truly. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. Your city, your country. I'd love to know who's in this room with me. A small note. This story contains fictional elements woven in for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarity to actual names or places is entirely coincidental. But the message it carries, that part is meant for you. It is 2 a.m. and I am standing in my kitchen staring at a cup of coffee I never drank. The mug is cold now. The cream has separated into a thin, pale ring along the surface. Outside, the last stubborn snow of March is still clinging to the roof of this house, the Vale Estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, like it cannot bring itself to let go. I understand the feeling. My name is Marceline Vale. I am 64 years old. I was a medical records manager for 22 years before I retired. I know how to read between the lines of a document, how to spot a number that does not belong, how to tell when something has been changed after the fact. People always underestimated that skill. They thought it was a clerical job. They were wrong. 9 years ago, I married Alden Vale at a small ceremony in the backyard of this very house. No grand reception, no 100-person guest list. Just the two of us, adjudge our daughter Elowyn and Mavis Crane, our housekeeper who cried harder than anyone. Alden wore a navy tie I had picked out for him. He looked at me the way a man looks when he has finally stopped running from something. Alden Vale was 72 years old and he had built Vale Meridian Construction from nothing. 40 years ago, he was a young man in worn-out work boots pouring concrete on job sites in Hartford. By the time I met him, his company was worth more than most people could count. But the thing about Alden, the thing that got me was that he never talked about the money. He talked about the buildings. He would point to a hospital wing or a bridge overpass and say, his voice rough with pride, "I put my hands on that. That's going to stand after I'm gone." He used to say something else, too. Something he told me on quiet evenings when we sat on the back porch and watched the lights come on across the lawn. "Marcy," he would say, squeezing my hand, "this house is going to be fine as long as I'm still standing." I used to smile when he said that. Now that sentence sits in my chest like a stone. The night everything broke open started like 100 other nights. Alden had gone to bed early. He'd been tired more often than usual in the weeks leading up to that evening, slower on the stairs, quieter at dinner, pausing mid-sentence in a way that made my stomach clench even when I told myself it was nothing. I had made a note of it in the small leather journal I keep on my nightstand. Old habit from my records days. Write it down, date it. You never know when a detail becomes evidence. I was in the kitchen making tea when I heard Mavis scream. It was not the kind of scream that makes you freeze. It was the kind that gets your legs moving before your brain catches up. Mavis Crane had worked for the Vale family for over 15 years. She was a sturdy, steady woman who had seen everything and flinched at almost nothing. When her voice cracked through the ceiling above me, I dropped the kettle and ran. I found her in the hallway outside the master bathroom, both hands pressed over her mouth, her face the color of chalk. "He fell," she choked out, grabbing my arm so hard her fingers left marks. "Mrs. Vale, he fell. I heard the crash. I can't get him to answer me." I pushed through the door. Alden was on the tile floor beside the sink, his body twisted at a wrong angle, one hand still gripping the edge of the counter above him. His face was slack on one side in a way that sent ice straight through my blood. I knelt down and pressed 2 fingers to his neck. His pulse was there, thin, irregular, but there. "Call 911. I told Mavis, and my voice came out steady, even though every nerve in my body was screaming. "Tell them stroke. Tell them he's 72. Tell them to hurry." She was already on the phone before I finished the sentence. The paramedics arrived in 11 minutes. I know because I counted. I held Alden's hand and talked to him. The entire time told him the ambulance was coming, told him I was right there, told him he was not allowed to go anywhere without my permission. His eyes did not open, but his fingers twitched once against my palm, and I decided to take that as an answer. Hargrove Medical Center. The waiting room on the 3rd floor smelled like industrial cleaner and burnt coffee. I sat in a plastic chair with my coat still on and my hands folded in my lap, and I waited. My daughter Elowen called from Philadelphia the moment I reached her. I could hear her voice fracture even as she fought to hold it together. "Mom, I'm coming right now," she said breathless. "Don't you dare tell me not to come." "I wouldn't dare," I said. She arrived 3 hours later, cheeks flushed from the cold eyes, red-rimmed and glistening. She wrapped her arms around me so tight I felt her shaking, and I held her back just as hard. Elowen was 27, a furniture restoration specialist with paint-stained fingers and her father's stubborn jaw. She adored Alden in the uncomplicated way a daughter adores a father who has always shown up for her. Cassian arrived 40 minutes after Elowen. Alden's son from his first marriage walked through the door in a charcoal overcoat, his expression composed, his steps unhurried. He nodded once in my direction. He did not ask how his father was. He did not hug Elowen. He looked around the waiting room the way a man looks when he is calculating something, and when his gaze landed on Elowen, it stayed there a beat too long. Something moved through me then, not fear exactly, recognition. The way you recognize a wrong number in a column of figures before you can even say why. Dr. Selina Carrick came out 20 minutes later. She was a composed woman in her late 40s, direct, in the way that only people who deliver bad news regularly can afford to be. "Mr. Vale has suffered a significant hemorrhagic stroke," she said, her eyes moving between the 3 of us. "He is stable for now, but we cannot make any projections about recovery at this stage. We'll know more in the next 48 hours. Elowen pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, her shoulders pulling inward tears, spilling fast and silent down her face. I reached over and gripped her hand. Cassian straightened his cuffs. "Who has authority to sign medical decisions for him?" he asked. His voice was even, professional, like he was asking about a conference room booking. Dr. Carrick looked at him, his wife as next of kin. Cassian's jaw tightened by exactly 1 degree. Later, standing in the parking garage while Elowen went to find a vending machine, I turned that question over in my mind. Not the answer I already knew the answer. The question itself, the timing of it. Alden was still in a trauma bay with tubes in his arm, and his son's first spoken words of the night were not, "Is he gonna be okay?" or "Can I see him?" or even "What happened?" They were, "Who has the power to sign?" I have spent 2 decades learning to read documents for what they do not say, and standing in that cold parking garage with the smell of antiseptic still in my coat, I understood with complete clarity that whatever was coming next, it had already started. They say sharks smell blood from a mile away. Cassian Vale did not even wait 48 hours. By the time the first week of April settled over Greenwich, he had established a rhythm at Hargrove Medical Center that had nothing to do with being a devoted son. Every morning shortly after 9, he would arrive at the 3rd floor with a man I had not seen before, tall, sharp-featured, carrying a leather portfolio that never left his arm. It took me 2 days to learn the man's name, Dorian Blackwell, a corporate attorney out of Midtown Manhattan, known for handling high-stakes estate disputes. He was not the kind of lawyer you called when you were grieving. He was the kind you called when you were calculating. I watched them from the end of the hallway. They kept their voices, low heads angled together, Dorian occasionally pressing a finger to a page in that portfolio, like he was marking coordinates on a map. Cassian would nod, straighten his jacket, look toward his father's room with an expression that had nothing warm in it. On the 3rd day, he cornered me near the elevator bank. "Marceline." He said my name the way some people say a word in a language they find distasteful. I've been thinking about the situation with Dad, and I want to be straightforward with you. This is a Vale family matter, a blood matter. You stepping back and letting me handle the medical decisions that would be the graceful move here. I looked at him for a moment. He was 45 years old, dressed like a man who had never once questioned his own importance, and he was staring at me with the patient confidence of someone who expected the world to rearrange itself on request. "Alden is my husband," I said, keeping my voice even and pleasant. "I am his next of kin. I will not be stepping back from anything." Something flickered behind his eyes, not anger, exactly more like recalculation. He gave me a thin smile. "Of course," he said. "Just a thought." He walked away without another word, and I turned back to the elevator and pressed the button and kept my face completely neutral while my heart hammered against my ribs. That same afternoon, Vesper arrived at the house. Cassian's wife was 41, a luxury real estate broker who wore her ambition the way other women wore perfume. You smelled it before she walked into the room. She appeared at the front door of the Vale estate in a camel-colored coat, her hair perfect, her smile the careful, measured kind that never quite reached her eyes. She told Mavis she had come to check on things, to help. Mavis called me at the hospital, her voice carefully flat. She walked through every room on the ground floor, Mrs. Vale, opened the door to Mr. Vale's study, stood in the doorway a long time. I offered her tea, and she said she was just making sure everything was in order. She was not checking on things. She was taking inventory. Later that week, I heard through Alden's cousin Margaret that Cassian had been making phone calls, telling people that Marceline, he apparently could not bring himself to call me Alden's wife, was an outsider who had inserted herself into the family. The decisions about Alden's care should be handled by actual blood. Margaret called me herself, her voice tight with discomfort. "I just thought you should know what he's saying, honey. I don't believe a word of it." I thanked her and wrote the date and her exact words in my journal. Cassian had also reached out to Marlo Ashford. Marlo was 68 years old, the aunt of Alden's first wife, Eleanor, a woman who had died of cancer 11 years before I ever met Alden. Marlo had never forgiven him for remarrying. She had never forgiven me for existing. She attended Vale family events with the energy of someone enduring a minor but persistent injustice, and Cassian had always known exactly how to use that. Whatever he said to her, I could only imagine. But I noticed at Alden's bedside the following Sunday, Marlo stood on the far side of the room and looked at me with renewed coldness. It was on a Tuesday that I saw Dorian Blackwell walking into Alden's room carrying a thick folder of papers. I had just stepped into the hallway to take a call from Elowen. When I came back not 10 minutes later, Dorian was gone and the door was closed. I asked the floor nurse, a young woman named Patrice, whether anyone had gone in. "The gentleman in the suit," she said. "He said he was the family's attorney." "Did he have Mr. Vale sign anything?" Patrice hesitated. I don't know, ma'am. I wasn't in the room." My stomach dropped 4 floors. I went in immediately. Alden lay still, his breathing measured by machines, his hands resting open at his sides. Nothing visibly disturbed, but I stood there with that cold, specific unease I used to get when a medical file had been touched by someone who had no business touching it, a feeling I had learned never to ignore. That evening, my phone rang as I pulled into the hospital parking structure. It was Mavis. "Mrs. Vale." Her voice dropped to just above a whisper. "Last night, after midnight, Mr. Cassian came to the house. I heard him in Mr. Alden's study." A pause. "I heard the safe open." I sat in my car in the dark of that concrete structure, the engine still running, the phone pressed hard against my ear. Outside, the sky over Greenwich was the flat, heavy gray of a sky that had given up on the season. I did not yell. I did not let myself cry. I set my jaw, opened my contacts, and scrolled to a name I had not called in over 2 years. Some people you only call when the situation has gone past the point of handling alone. The kitchen was still half dark when my phone rang. 6:14 in the morning. I had misread the clock at first, but checked again. The gray light of an April dawn was barely edging through the window above the sink. My coffee was just starting to brew, and the sound of that ringtone cut through the quiet of the house like something that had been waiting for exactly the right moment to arrive. The number on the screen was a Connecticut area code I did not recognize. "Good morning. May I speak with Marceline Vale?" The voice was professional, measured the careful tone of someone trained to deliver uncertain news without alarming people before they had to be alarmed. "Speaking," I said. "This is Dana Whitfield calling from GenCore Diagnostics Laboratory in Stamford. We received a DNA sample submission last week filed under the name Elowin Vale with a request for parentage analysis. Standard procedure requires us to verify consent documentation before processing any third-party sample, and the authorization paperwork submitted with this request does not meet our legal requirements." A brief pause. "We were unable to reach Ms. Vale directly. You are listed as her emergency contact. I want to make sure you're aware this submission was made." I set my coffee mug down on the counter very carefully. "I appreciate you calling," I said. "Can you give me the date the sample was received, the submission reference number, and the name listed on the authorization form?" There was a short silence. She'd not expected that response. Most people, I imagine, would have asked what a parentage analysis was or demanded to know who had sent it or fallen apart entirely. I had spent 22 years in medical records management. I knew exactly which questions mattered. She gave me all three. I wrote them into my journal in the same neat columns I had used for 20 years of documentation: date, reference code, name of submitting party. The name she read me landed in my chest like a stone dropped into still water, but my handwriting did not change. I thanked her, confirmed I would follow up directly, and ended the call. Then I stood at the kitchen counter and let myself breathe for exactly 60 seconds. I thought about Cassian arriving at the house with Vesper 10 days earlier. I thought about Mavis mentioning almost in passing that she had seen him walking the upstairs hallway, pausing near Elowin's old room, the one she still used when she visited. I thought about the hairbrush on the vanity table in that room, the one Elowin had left behind on her last visit in February. A small thing, the kind of thing a person would never notice missing, unless they were looking for it. I closed my journal, picked up my keys, and drove to Stamford. Hollis Wren's office occupied the third floor of a federal-style building 2 blocks from the Stamford courthouse. He had practiced estate and trust law for over 40 years, and his office looked exactly like what it was, a room full of paper that had been handled with great care for a very long time. Dark wood, organized shelves, no unnecessary decoration. Hollis himself was 71, lean and unhurried, with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that patience was the most effective tool in almost any situation. He had been Alden's attorney for 15 years. He had drawn up our prenuptial agreement, our joint estate documents, and the Vale family trust revisions after Elowin was born. If Alden trusted anyone with the architecture of his private life, it was Hollis. I sat down across from his desk and told him everything. The call from GenCore, the submission, Cassian's daily appearances at the hospital with Dorian Blackwell, Vesper walking through the house, the safe opening at midnight. I spoke in the same order I had written it, chronological, factual, without editorializing. Hollis sat with his hands folded on the desk and did not interrupt once. When I finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past on the street below. Hollis looked at me steadily. "Marceline." He said, "Alden came to see me 3 weeks before he was admitted to the hospital." I held very still. He had concerns about Cassian's management of certain company finances. He wouldn't tell me the full extent of what he suspected. He said he didn't have enough to act on yet. But he asked me to make changes to the trust structure as a precaution. Hollis paused. He amended the trustee designation. The person who now holds authority over the Vale family trust is not Cassian. That change was executed, notarized, and filed before Alden lost capacity. The weight of that settled over me slowly, the way a heavy coat settles onto shoulders. "Cassian doesn't know," I said. It was not quite a question. "Cassian knows the trust exists," Hollis said. He does not know what Alden changed or when or who currently holds that authority, and Alden was very specific about something else. He opened the lower drawer of his desk and set an envelope on the surface between us, plain white sealed, my name written across the front in Alden's handwriting, the careful, slightly forward-leaning cursive he used when he was writing something he wanted to get exactly right. "He told me to give this to you," Hollis said quietly, "when you needed it most." I looked at the envelope for a long moment. My name in my husband's handwriting, sitting on a lawyer's desk while my husband lay in a hospital bed, 2 miles away, his hands open and still. My fingers did not tremble when I picked it up. I turned it once in my hands, then slid it into my bag. "Not yet," I said. Hollis nodded as though he had expected exactly that answer. I stood up, straightened my jacket, and looked at him directly. "I need to understand how far this has already gone before I use anything. Can you start pulling together what you know about the trust documentation and the changes Alden made?" "Already started," he said. "The morning you called me." I paused at the door. 2 nights ago, standing in a hospital parking structure in the dark, I had scrolled to his name in my contacts and made the call I had known I was going to have to make. He had answered on the second ring, listened for 3 minutes, and said, "Come to my office when you're ready." That was the thing about Hollis Wren. He never needed to be told twice. For 22 years, I managed medical records for a regional health network in Connecticut. People assume that kind of work is passive filing, sorting, maintaining. What it actually is reading. Reading documents the way a geologist reads rock strata, looking for the layer that does not belong the formation that shifted when nothing should have shifted. Let me be specific about what I mean. In medical records work, you learn to spot numbers that are slightly too round a coincidence that happens once, but not 4 times in a row. You learn to notice dates that land on holidays when no one should have been signing anything. You learn to feel the difference in a signature whose pen pressure changes mid-page as if a different hand took over halfway through. These are not dramatic clues. They are quiet ones. But in my experience, quiet clues are the ones that matter most because they are the ones that someone tried hardest to hide. I know what concealment looks like inside a document, and I know it the moment I see it, not because I am clever, but because I have seen it before and written it down. The morning after I left Hollis's office, I sat at the desk in my home study with a fresh legal pad and did what I had done for 2 decades. Whenever something did not add up, I wrote it all out in order. Every irregular thing I had observed in the past 4 weeks. Dorian Blackwell's unexplained visit to Alden's room, a corporate estate attorney, with no medical reason to be there, carrying a portfolio he never opened in front of me. The safe opening at midnight heard by Mavis through walls she had known for 15 years. Cassian's daily appearances at the hospital with that same portfolio, heads together with Dorian voices, low fingers pressing against pages like men marking coordinates on a map. Vesper walking through rooms she had no business walking through, opening the study door and standing in the frame too long. The GenCore submission ADNA test filed without Allowance knowledge, using a sample that had to have been taken from her personal belongings. The hairbrush missing from the vanity table in her old room. By the time I reached the bottom of the first page, my jaw was tight and my chest ached with the particular pain of seeing a pattern you had hoped was not really there. But I did not let myself stop. I drew a line under the list and wrote the word needed across the top of the next page. This second list was not about what I had already seen. It was about what I still required the categories of evidence that would need to exist before any of what I knew could be used. Financial records to understand whether Cassian had a motive beyond ambition. Hospital documentation to establish what had actually happened in that room at 2:47 in the morning. Trust paperwork to confirm that Hollis's changes had been properly filed and could not be challenged. Digital footprints. The electronic traces that people forget they leave behind every time they open a file, send a message, or use a credential that is not their own. I looked at both lists for a moment. The first was what Cassian had done. The second was what I needed to prove it. Then I picked up my phone and called Rowan Vey. We met at a coffee shop on Atlantic Street in Stamford, a narrow place with exposed brick walls and the permanent smell of dark roast. Rowan was 42, compact and unhurried, with the kind of face that gave away nothing and recorded everything. He had spent 15 years as a financial investigator, the kind of work that involves following a money trail the way a bloodhound follows a scent through shell companies, and falsified reports, and carefully obscured debts until the trail either goes cold or leads somewhere definitive. He had spent the last 8 years working independently, mostly for insurance companies, tracking fraud and misrepresented assets. That was how I had first encountered him 3 years earlier, when his work had crossed over with a claims dispute I was managing. I had recognized immediately that he was thorough in the specific way that matters. He did not stop when the surface looked clean. He kept going until he understood why the surface looked clean. I sat down across from him, ordered nothing, and told him what I needed. I kept it direct, the COO of a family construction company, potential undisclosed debt, possible misuse of company assets, any irregularities in public filings within the past 3 years. I did not tell him everything. I gave him enough to start. When I finished, Rowan turned his mug slowly between his palms, his brow creasing in that way it did when he was already running numbers in his head. "You know, this kind of work takes time to do properly," he said. "If there's something buried, I need to dig carefully so it stays admissible. 3 weeks minimum, and my rate has gone up since we last worked together." "Rowan," I met his eyes across the table. "Find me what's there, whatever it costs." Something shifted in his expression, not quite sympathy, more like the focused gravity of a man who had just accepted a job he understood mattered. He gave me a short nod and reached for his phone to start making notes. That evening, I drove the 90 minutes to New Haven. Orson Vale was 35 and lived in a third-floor apartment that looked at first glance like a controlled explosion in a server room. Cables ran along baseboards. 3 monitors sat in a curved arc on his desk, and there were sticky notes on almost every flat surface. He was my late mother's sister's grandson, which made us cousins of the kind that does not have a clean English word. And he was the only person I trusted completely in the digital dimension of this situation. Where Rowan followed money, Orson followed data. His expertise was in digital forensics, the recovery and analysis of electronic records that people believed they had secured, hidden, or destroyed. He understood that every action taken on a computer system leaves a mark, a timestamp, a terminal ID, a credential code, a modification history. These marks are not always visible to the casual eye, but they do not disappear. They accumulate in server logs and metadata files and access records, waiting for someone who knows how to read them. He opened the door in a faded MIT sweatshirt, took one look at my face and stepped back to let me in without preamble. "Tell me," he said, dropping into his desk chair and spinning to face me. I told him about the hospital, Dorian's visit to Alden's room, the possibility that someone had used Alden's patient credentials to push a document through the electronic records system while he was sedated and unable to consent. The GenCore submission filed with an authorization that the laboratory had already flagged as irregular. Orson listened with his elbows on his knees, leaning forward, occasionally pressing his lips together in the way he did when something bothered him technically. "Hospital systems log everything," he said when I finished, his voice picking up energy the way it always did when a problem engaged him. "Every access, every digital signature, every timestamp including which terminal initiated the action, and under whose login credentials. If someone used your husband's patient account to submit a document while he was under sedation, there will be a precise record of exactly when that happened, from which physical machine in the building, and under what authorization." He tapped his fingers against his knee once, twice, 3 times. "And if those photographs they are using against you were altered, the image file will still contain its original metadata, the date it was created, the software used to modify it, and a record of every edit made after the original capture. You cannot scrub all of that cleanly, not if you know where to look." Can you access the hospital logs legitimately? I asked. I needed everything we found to hold up, not just to be true. With your written authorization as his legal next of kin and a properly formatted request through the hospital's authorized representative portal, yes. He was already pulling up a browser window. Give me a few days to map the request pathway correctly and send me anything digital you think has been altered documents, images, anything. I drove home through the dark stretch of I-95 with my hands steady on the wheel and something settling into place behind my sternum. Not comfort, exactly, but the specific relief of knowing that the people you need are already in motion. The next morning, I stopped at Hargrove on my way to a follow-up meeting with Hollis. Alden's room was quiet, the machines maintaining their patient rhythm beside him. I stood at his bedside for a few minutes, holding his hand, watching his chest rise and fall. On the small table beside his bed, between the water pitcher and a get-well card from his former site foreman, sat a vase of white lilies. The nursing staff sometimes set out simple arrangements like this on long-stay wards. Nothing unusual about the gesture itself, but something about its position stopped me. It was not centered on the table the way a decorative arrangement would naturally be placed. It was angled slightly tilted toward the bed, toward Alden. The stem cluster at the base was denser than the flowers required, slightly too bulky for the arrangement above it, as if something had been set into the foam beneath the stems that was not part of the original display. I did not move it. I did not touch it at all. I am not a technical person by training, and I understood that if my instinct was correct, disturbing the arrangement before Orson could examine it could destroy whatever it contained. I simply took out my journal and wrote, "White lily vase bedside table angled toward patient base appears denser than arrangement requires. Do not disturb. Show Orson." 20 years of records work. You write down what you see before you decide what it means. You do not touch what you cannot yet explain. 2 days later, my phone rang while I was sorting through mail at the kitchen table. Rowan. "I've only been at this 48 hours, he said, and his voice had an edge to it I had not heard before. Not alarm exactly, but the particular tension of a man who has lifted a rock and found something unexpected underneath. Marceline Alden's son is in serious debt, and I haven't even gotten to the second layer yet. My pen went still against the paper. Outside, a late April wind pushed through the oak trees along the back fence, rattling the branches hard. How serious, I said. The kind of serious, Rowan said, that makes a man do things he would not otherwise consider. The kind of serious where losing an inheritance is no longer about wanting more, it is about survival. It is about what happens to a man when the water is already at his chin and he sees something solid within reach. I set the pen down. I had worked long enough around insurance fraud to understand what that meant. A person drowning in debt does not think carefully about what he grabs onto. He does not weigh the cost to the people around him. He simply reaches for whatever is closest and holds on with everything he has. If what Cassian was reaching for was my family, I needed to know exactly how deep the water was before he pulled us all under. I have lived 64 years without once seeing my name attached to a headline. I had no social media presence, no public profile, nothing beyond the quiet paper trail of a woman who had spent her career in records rather than in the spotlight. That Monday morning changed all of that. My phone started ringing at 6:52. Elowen. Mom. Her voice was tight, the kind of tight that happens when someone has been holding themselves together for the 10 minutes it took to decide whether to call. There's something online. Someone wrote they're saying you... She stopped, and I heard her pull in a sharp breath like she was trying not to cry. Mom, they're implying you've been seeing someone. While Dad is in the hospital, they have a photo. I felt something cold move through my chest, but I kept my voice level. Send me the link, I said. Right now, before you say anything else to anyone. The article came through 30 seconds later. It was posted on a site called the Hargrove Ledger, not a newspaper, a lifestyle and gossip blog that covered wealthy Connecticut families with the particular enthusiasm of someone who had never been invited to their parties. The author was listed as Michelle Rowan. The piece itself was careful in the way that legally cautious malice is always careful, no direct accusations, only insinuations dressed up in concerned language. Sources close to the Vale family have raised questions about the conduct of Marceline Vale, 64, the second wife of ailing construction magnate Alden Vale, during this difficult period, and so on. The photo was embedded midway through the piece, grainy shot from a distance clearly taken with a long lens from across the street. It showed me walking through the entrance of the Meridian Hotel in Stamford, a hotel whose ground floor hosted a private conference suite regularly used by law firms in the area for sensitive client meetings. Beside me was the partial figure of a man in a dark suit. I enlarged the image on my screen and studied it for a long time. The crop was deliberate. Whoever had edited this photo had removed the right side of the frame entirely. What remained visible of the man beside me was a shoulder half a lapel and the distinctive sleeve of a dark navy blazer with a narrow chalk stripe that I had seen across a desk from me for 15 years. That was Hollis Wren's jacket. I would have recognized it in poor lighting at twice the distance. Allawan. I said, I need you to listen to me carefully. Do not post anything. Do not respond to anyone who reaches out about this. Not a word, not a reaction, not even a like on someone else's comment. Can you do that for me? Mom, this is insane. Her voice cracked on the last word, anger and hurt spilling through together. People are going to read this and think I can't just let them think. I know. I kept my voice steady even as my heart ached for her for the way she always wanted to charge straight at the thing that was hurting her. And we are going to address it, but not yet and not like this. Trust me. A long pause. Then, okay, but Mom, they mentioned me in it too. The way they phrased it, there's something about Allawan Vale's place in the family going forward. Her voice dropped lower. It's mean, Mom. Whoever wrote this, it feels personal. I filed that observation away and told her I loved her and ended the call. Mavis appeared in the kitchen doorway a few minutes later, still in her robe face, drawn with worry. She had already seen it. Patrice from the hospital had texted her before 7. There was a car outside the gate 3 nights ago, Mavis said, gripping her coffee mug with both hands. Dark gray sedan. I didn't think much of it at the time, but it sat there for almost 40 minutes just facing the house. Then it left. She pressed her lips together hard. I should have told you sooner. I'm sorry, Mrs. Vale. You're telling me now, I said. That's what matters. Do you remember anything about the car? Connecticut plates. I didn't get the full number, but the front end, I think it was a Mercedes. New model. Vesper drove a gunmetal Mercedes GLE. I had seen it in the Vale driveway a dozen times. By mid-morning, my phone had collected 4 missed calls from extended family members and a text from Gerald Marsh, who had been Alden's college roommate and had built a 40-year friendship on a foundation of absolute discretion. His message read, Only Marceline. Seen the piece. Don't believe a word. Call if you need anything. I appreciated Gerald more in that moment than I could have expressed. I called Hollis at 11. I need to read you something, I said when he picked up, and I read him the relevant section of the article, including the description of the photograph. There was a brief pause on his end, not the pause of someone caught off guard, but the pause of someone rapidly cross-referencing a memory with new information. I remember that day, he said, his voice measured and precise. We had just finished a 2-hour meeting about the trust revisions. You had parked in the structure, and I had walked you out through the hotel lobby because it was raining. We were outside for less than 4 minutes. Another short pause. Someone was watching that entrance. Someone with a camera and a very specific reason to want that image. I said, The crop removes me almost entirely, Hollis said, and I could hear the controlled anger in his voice, now a low current running beneath the professional calm. Which means whoever did this knew who I was and chose to hide it. If I had been visible, the obvious explanation that you were meeting your attorney would have neutralized the entire insinuation. The article had been designed not to inform, but to imply, and the implication only worked if Hollis was invisible. I thought about Vesper walking through the rooms of this house with her careful eyes and her real estate broker's instinct for appraising everything she saw. I thought about how long it takes to set up a surveillance operation to identify the right location, hire the right photographer, wait for the right moment. She had not come to check on Alden. She had come to map the territory, and someone had been photographing me for longer than I had realized. The question that sat with me for the rest of that day was not who had done this. I already knew. It was how long they had been watching and what else they might have captured. 20 years in medical records taught me one immutable truth. A doctor does not write the wrong medication code twice in the same direction by accident. Random errors scatter. They go high, then low, then sideways. Errors that move in one consistent direction, always toward the same outcome, always serving the same purpose, are not errors at all. They are instructions. I had requested a summary copy of Alden's treatment records 3 days earlier, citing my rights as his legal spouse and authorized representative under HIPAA. The floor administrator had been pleasant about it, if a little surprised most family members I suspected did not ask for documentation in a specific format with reference codes included. I did. I sat in the third-floor family waiting room with the pages spread across the low table in front of me, a cup of vending machine coffee gone cold at my elbow. The room smelled like carpet cleaner and recycled air. A television mounted in the corner was running a morning talk show with the sound turned low. I ignored all of it and read. On the surface, Alden's chart was unremarkable. Hemorrhagic stroke standard acute care protocol neurology consults physical therapy assessments. But on the 4th page, in the medication administration log, something stopped me cold. On April 19th at 2:47 in the morning, a sedative lorazepam 2 milligrams intravenous had been administered and logged under a nursing credential I did not recognize from any other entry in the chart. Every other medication entry for Alden had been logged by one of 3 nurses on his regular rotation. This entry belonged to someone named S. Merritt. I cross-checked the medication orders. There was no physician order authorizing that administration. The sedative had been given logged and signed off, but with no corresponding doctor's order attached to it. In 22 years of records work, I had seen that pattern exactly twice. Both times it had meant something had gone very wrong in that room. I wrote down the code, the timestamp, the credential ID, and the absence of the physician order. Then I folded the pages, put them in my bag, and went to find Dr. Celine Carrick. Her office was at the end of the neurology corridor, a small room that reflected the precise, uncluttered mind of the woman who occupied it. When I knocked, she looked up from her desk with the measured expression of someone who had learned to read the emotional temperature of a room before deciding how to respond to it. "Mrs. Vale," she said carefully, "is something wrong with your husband's condition?" "Not his condition," I said. "May I sit down?" She gestured to the chair across from her. I sat, opened my bag, and placed the printed records on the desk between us. I did not say anything immediately. I simply pointed to the line I had circled, the S. Merritt entry, the timestamp, the missing order. Dr. Celine leaned forward. The moment her eyes found that line, the careful professional composure on her face shifted not dramatically, but unmistakably. Her jaw tightened. A muscle near her temple flickered. She pressed 2 fingers against the page as though confirming she was reading what she thought she was reading. "That entry," I said quietly, "was made at 2:47 in the morning. There is no corresponding physician order. The nurse credential belongs to someone named S. Merritt, who does not appear anywhere else in my husband's chart." I paused. "Can you tell me who Sable Merritt is?" Dr. Celine pulled her hand back from the page. Her voice, when she answered, was tight with something she was working hard to contain. "She's a night shift nurse. She's not assigned to this floor's regular rotation." She stopped herself, visibly recalibrating. "Mrs. Vale, where did you get this copy?" "From your floor administrator as my husband's legal representative." I met her eyes. "Dr. Carrick, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that I am not here to cause problems for you or for this hospital. I am here because my husband is lying in a room down this hallway, and someone has been working very hard to use that room against him. My voice tightened on the last sentence, despite my best effort to hold it steady. Has anyone approached you and asked you to sign documentation confirming that my husband had the cognitive capacity to execute legal documents? The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of something Dr. Celine was deciding whether to say. Then she let out a slow breath through her nose, and something in her posture changed. The guardedness fell away degree by degree, replaced by an anger that was sharp and professional and absolutely genuine. 2 men came to see me, she said, her voice dropping to something close to controlled fury. About 3 weeks ago, one of them introduced himself as Cassian Vale. The other was an attorney Blackwell, I think. They were very polished about it. Her upper lip tightened. They told me they needed a capacity assessment, signed a document confirming that Mr. Vale had been lucid and competent on a specific date, specifically April 19th. April 19th, the same date as the S. Merit entry, the same date as the 247 administration. I told them no, Dr. Celine said, and her voice carried the particular heat of someone who had been genuinely offended by what she had been asked to do. Mr. Vale's neurological profile on that date did not support a capacity assessment. His Glasgow coma scale scores were inconsistent, his sedation levels were irregular, and now looking at what you've just shown me, she stopped jaw-working. I told them no, she repeated, and when the attorney started talking about the hospital's relationship with the Vale Family Foundation and what that might mean going forward, I asked them both to leave my office. They threatened you, I said. They implied consequences, she said precisely. It is not the same thing in their minds. It is exactly the same thing in mine. She held my gaze for a moment, and in her eyes I saw something I recognized, the banked, focused anger of a woman who had been pushed in a direction she refused to go. Mrs. Vale, I want you to know that I documented that meeting the same day it happened. She opened the bottom drawer of her desk. From the back of it, she withdrew a small Ziploc bag. Inside was a cell phone, older model, screen dark. I recorded the entire conversation, she said, setting it on the desk between us. From the moment they sat down, I looked at that small phone in its clear plastic bag, and for the first time in weeks, I felt something shift beneath me, not the ground giving way, but the ground holding. A solidness I had not felt since the night Mavis had screamed from upstairs. But as I reached out to take it, another thought moved through me like a cold current. The medication code in that chart, the one logged by Sable Merritt with no physician order, the one that appeared on the exact date Cassian needed Alden incapacitated, had one peculiarity I had not mentioned to Dr. Celine yet. The code itself was wrong, not just unauthorized. The specific code entered did not match the drug listed beside it. In 22 years, I had seen honest mistakes in medication logging. They looked chaotic. They corrected in different directions. This error was clean, consistent, and it pointed with quiet precision directly at the administration it was meant to document. Someone had made that mistake very carefully, and careful mistakes, in my experience, are never really mistakes at all. People lie every day. They do it fluently, convincingly sometimes, so well they start believing their own version of events. But a computer does not lie. A computer records exactly what happened, exactly when it happened, from exactly which terminal it happened, and it keeps that record long after the person who created it has forgotten or decided it no longer matters. Orson Vale understood this better than almost anyone I knew, and on a Friday evening in late May, I drove the 90 minutes to New Haven with a bag full of things that needed to stop being questions and start being facts. His apartment looked the same as my last visit, 3 monitors in a curved arc, cables running along the baseboards, the faint blue glow that seemed to emanate from every surface. He'd been expecting me. There was a second chair pulled up beside his desk and a fresh pot of coffee on the kitchen counter that he had clearly made approximately 4 minutes before I knocked. "Everything you have," he said before I had even sat down. "Documents, the phone, the USB with the hospital request authorization, all of it." I laid it out in front of him, the printed medication log with the S. Merritt entry, circled Dr. Cellini's phone, still in its Ziploc bag, the formal HIPAA authorization I had filed 3 weeks earlier that had granted Orson read-only access to Alden's electronic medical records through the hospital's authorized representative portal. He had spent those 3 weeks building the access pathway carefully legally so that everything he pulled would hold up if it ever needed to. He started with the photograph, the image file from the blog post, he said, pulling it up on the center screen. "Let's see what it's actually made of." Metadata analysis, he explained as he worked, reads the hidden information embedded in every digital image file, the date and time it was created, the device that captured it, any software used to modify it, and critically, whether the file had been altered after its original creation. His fingers moved across the keyboard with the particular confidence of someone who had done this hundreds of times and found it as natural as reading. "Original capture," he said, pointing to a line of data on the left screen. "March 28th, the photo of you and Mr. Wren outside the Meridian Hotel was taken on March 28th. He clicked twice. The cropped version, the one posted on the blog, was created on April 4th. 7 days later, he tapped the screen. And the editing software that produced it left a very specific signature in the file structure. It's a professional photo editing suite, not a free consumer app, someone who knows what they're doing. Can you identify who he may?" I asked. "Not the person, but I can identify the machine the software license is registered, and the file fingerprint matches edits made on the same device to at least 2 other image files I found cached in the blog's content delivery network." He glanced over at me. "Someone used the same setup multiple times. That's a pattern. Patterns are traceable." I felt a tight, focused energy move through me. Not excitement exactly, but the particular alertness of a person watching pieces align. "Now, the hospital records," Orson said, and his voice shifted the way a person's voice shifts when they move from something interesting to something that genuinely disturbs them. Through the authorized portal, he had already pulled Alden's electronic records for the relevant date range. He opened the access log on the right screen, a column of timestamps, terminal IDs, and credential codes, tracking every interaction with Alden's file. "April 19th, he said, 2:47 a.m. A document was accessed, populated with Mr. Vale's identifying information, and submitted through the hospital's electronic record system under a credential set linked to his patient account." He pointed to the entry. That document was a consent form authorizing transfer of medical decision-making authority. My stomach dropped. "And here," Orson said, pulling up the medication log on the second screen so both were visible side by side, "is the S. Merritt entry you found. Same date, same time, 2:47 a.m. He turned to look at me directly, and his expression was the most serious I had ever seen it. D. Marceline, whoever submitted that document at 2:47 in the morning, was not Uncle Alden. I can tell you that with complete technical certainty. His patient account credentials were used, but the terminal access originated from a device that has never been registered to him and was not located in his room." He paused, letting that land. "Digitally speaking, Alden Vale did not exist at 2:47 that morning. He was sedated unresponsive, and his identity was being used by someone else in this building." The room felt very still. Outside, a truck rumbled past on the street below. The coffee in my mug had gone cold without my noticing. "The consent form," I said, my voice coming out steadier than I felt. "Is it in the system?" "It was submitted. It was not countersigned by the attending physician, which means it has no current legal standing, but it exists as a submitted document, which means someone was planning to use it as the foundation for something larger." He pulled up one more window, an email thread. "And there's this, an internal message forwarded into the hospital's administrative system from an external address. Not a Vail Company domain, not a personal address I can immediately identify. It was sent 2 days before April 19th. The subject line is blank. The body contains only a date, a time, and the words confirm when done. I stared at that email on the screen, 6 words stripped of everything except intent. Cassian did not know we had found this. He was still operating under the assumption that the documents he had prepared were intact, that the timestamp buried in a hospital server at 2:47 in the morning was invisible, that the digital fingerprint left on a cropped photograph was too small to matter. He had built his plan on the belief that no one would look closely enough. He had not counted on Orson, and he had not counted on me. Rain had been falling over Stamford since mid-morning, the steady gray kind that makes the whole city look like it is being slowly erased. Rowan's office was on the second floor of a narrow building near the waterfront, up a staircase that smelled of old wood and dry paper, small, deliberately unremarkable, the kind of space that told you exactly nothing about the man who worked in it, which was, I suspected, entirely intentional. He was standing at his desk when I arrived, not seated. A large sheet of drafting paper was spread across the surface, held flat at the corners by a stapler, a coffee mug, a thick manila folder, and what appeared to be a river stone he used as a paperweight. On the paper, in his careful, compressed handwriting, was a diagram boxes connected by arrows numbers, written in red company names, abbreviated and linked by lines that branched and rejoined in ways that made my stomach tighten, just looking at them. "Close the door," he said without looking up. I did. I hung my coat on the hook beside the entrance and came to stand across the desk from him. Outside, the rain tapped steadily against the window. "How bad?" I asked. Rowan finally looked up. In 15 years of working adjacent to investigators and auditors and claims specialists, I had learned to read the difference between professional concern and genuine alarm. What I saw on Rowan's face was the second one. "Sit down, Marceline," he said. "This is going to take a few minutes." He walked me through it the way a surgeon describes a scan methodically without unnecessary drama, letting the facts carry their own weight. Cassian Vail had borrowed $11.6 million. Not in his own name, that would have been traceable within weeks. Instead, he had routed the debt through 3 limited liability companies, all registered in Delaware, all incorporated within an 18-month window 2 years ago. Delaware's corporate registration laws required minimal disclosure of beneficial ownership, which made it the jurisdiction of choice for anyone who wanted the legal protection of a corporate structure without the transparency. The 3 entities had names that sounded like unremarkable real estate holding companies. They were, in fact, empty vessels, no employees, no assets of their own, no operating activity. Their sole purpose was to borrow money and pass it to Cassian. "Who lent it?" I asked. 2 private credit funds and 1 individual lender operating through a 4th Delaware entity. Rowan tapped the diagram with his pen. The individual lender is the concerning one. Private lenders who operate through shell structures at this scale are not patient people, and the repayment deadline on all 3 facilities lands within the same 30-day window, December of this year. December, 8 months away. I looked at the number written in red at the top of the diagram, $11.6 million, and felt the full weight of it settle over the room. "The collateral," I said. "That's where it becomes a different kind of problem entirely." Rowan moved his pen to the right side of the diagram. "Cassian holds a minority equity stake in Vail Meridian Construction shares that were transferred to him by Alden approximately 6 years ago as part of a succession planning arrangement. Those shares are his personal property. He pledged them as collateral for the first 2 loan facilities." He paused. "That part, while reckless, is legally within his rights as the shareholder of record." But I said, because there was clearly a but. But he also pledged forward contracts, future construction agreements that Vail Meridian has not yet executed, revenue the company hasn't earned. Those contracts belong to the company, not to Cassian personally. Pledging them required authorization he does not have, and almost certainly did not obtain. Rowan's jaw tightened briefly, And he was able to do it because the chief financial officer of Vale Meridian, a man named Gideon Strake, who's been with the company for 11 years, has been adjusting the financial reporting for the past 2 fiscal years to conceal the irregularities. Gideon Strake. I wrote the name in my journal and underlined it. Adjusting how? I asked. Moving liabilities between reporting periods, reclassifying certain obligations as contingent rather than current so they don't appear on the balance sheet in the way they should, understating the encumbrance on the forward contracts. Rowan's voice carried a flat professional disgust. It's not crude work. Whoever taught Gideon Strake accounting taught him well. But the seams show if you know what you're looking at, and I've been looking at fraudulent financials for 15 years. Can this be proven with the right subpoena and the right forensic accountant? Yes, the records exist. They've been altered, but alteration leaves traces version. Histories, filing, timestamps, discrepancies between internal documents and external submissions. He set the pen down. The problem is accessing those records without tipping Cassian off. Once he knows someone is looking at the company's books, Gideon will either destroy everything or run. I thought about that for a moment. Then I thought about something else, something I had observed across years of insurance claims work, where fraud was almost always a team effort, and teams almost always had a weakest member. Would Gideon have kept anything for himself? I asked. Copies, documentation, something he could use if Cassian tried to make him the fall guy. Rowan looked at me with an expression that was almost not quite, but almost a smile. In my experience, accountants who help their employers commit fraud always keep something. They know better than anyone how easily books can be rewritten to tell a different story about who gave what instruction. He picked up his coffee mug. A CFO who helps bury $11 million in debt does not sleep well at night, and people who don't sleep well tend to prepare for the worst. I made a note of that. Rowan slid the diagram across the desk until it rested in front of me, the red number at the top, the 3 Delaware boxes, the arrows pointing back to Cassian's name like accusatory fingers. He's not trying to take his father's estate because he wants more, Rowan said. He's trying to take it because without it, he goes under. The debt comes due in December. The company could be pulled apart by creditors before Christmas. He met my eyes steadily. This is not ambition, Marceline. This is a man drowning in the dark, grabbing at anything within reach. I sat with that for a moment, the cold arithmetic of desperation, the way it strips a person down to pure survival instinct and makes them capable of things they might otherwise never consider. A drowning man does not think about who he pulls down with him. He just pulls. We are exactly halfway through, and what's coming next is where everything begins to shift. Before I go further, drop a 9 in the comments right now. Just that number. It tells me you're still here, and honestly, knowing you're with me makes all the difference. A note worth mentioning: this story weaves in fictional elements for storytelling purposes. Some details have been shaped to carry the lesson more clearly. If that's not the kind of content you're here for, no pressure at all. You're free to step away anytime. A coward is never loyal, but every now and then, the very quality that makes a person a coward, that bone-deep instinct for self-preservation, that radar that is always pointed toward the nearest exit, turns out to be the thing that saves someone else. Gideon Strake did not contact me directly. He contacted Rowan first through a message left on a professional referral line that Rowan kept specifically for situations where a source needed plausible distance from their initial approach. Rowan forwarded the message to me with a single line of his own. He wants to meet. I'd take the meeting. The restaurant Gideon had chosen was a Portuguese place in the outer reaches of Stamford's west side, the kind of establishment that did a solid lunch trade and was reliably quiet by mid-evening. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a corner table with my back to the wall and a clear view of the entrance. 14 minutes after our agreed time, Gideon Strake walked through the door. I recognized him from the Vale Meridian corporate website, a photograph taken at a company event 3 years ago. where he had been standing at the edge of a group photo with the slightly stiff posture of a man who attended such functions because he had to. In person, he looked worse than the photograph. He was 53, but carrying the drawn, hollowed look of someone who had not been sleeping, and the way his eyes swept the room when he entered rapid involuntary told me he had been doing that every time he walked into any room for a while now. He spotted me cross to the table and sat down without taking off his coat. "I wasn't followed," he said immediately, as though he needed to establish that before anything else. "I know," I said. "I've been here long enough to be sure." He looked at me for a moment, this 64-year-old woman sitting quietly across from him, and something in his expression shifted. I think he had expected someone more visibly frightened. The fact that I was not seemed to unsettle him more than fear would have. He reached into his coat and placed a small padded envelope on the table between us. Inside, I could feel the shape of a USB drive. "Cassian called me last week," he said, his voice low and tight. "He told me that if any financial irregularities at the company came under scrutiny, the documentation trail would point to me, that I had acted independently without his knowledge for personal gain." His jaw tightened, and I saw a flash of genuine anger cross his face before fear swallowed it back down. 11 years I gave that company. 11 years. And he picked up the phone and told me in 4 sentences that he would burn me to the ground if it came to it. "So you decided not to go down alone," I said. "I decided," Gideon said carefully, "that I was not going to be the only person in that room without documentation." He pushed the envelope across the table. "Every email instruction Cassian sent me, the original versions of the financial reports before I altered them alongside the altered versions, both copies with timestamps, wire transfer authorizations with his digital signature, the shell company and corporation documents, and the correspondence between those entities and the lenders." He stopped, swallowed. "It's all on there. Everything." I did not reach for the envelope immediately. "Why a USB?" I asked. "Why not send it digitally?" "Because digital transmissions leave origin points," he said. "And because I needed to give you something I could also take back if this conversation went differently than I hoped." He looked at his hands on the table. "I've been in finance long enough to know that information is only leverage when it's controlled." I picked up the envelope. "There's a password," he said. I said it intentionally. I needed to know that whoever opened it would be the right person. He met my eyes. "I've worked for Alden Vale for 11 years, long enough to know that he put fresh flowers on his desk every year on the same date, always white, always just one arrangement, and he never explained it to anyone. Never. But I asked his executive assistant about it once years ago, and she told me." He paused. "I use that date as the password. If you know Alden Vale well enough to know that date, then you're exactly who I need to give this to." I held the envelope in both hands. I already knew which date he meant. Alden had never spoken Eleanor's name in front of me, not once in 9 years of marriage. But every September 9th, without comment or explanation, a single arrangement of white freesias would appear on the corner of his desk. He would be quieter that day. I never asked. Some silences are not mine to fill. "I understand," I said. Gideon looked at me with an expression I could not entirely read, somewhere between relief and shame, and the particular exhaustion of a person who has been holding something very heavy for a very long time. "I'm not a good man," he said quietly. "I want you to know I'm aware of that." "You're trying to be better than you were last week," I said. "That's what matters now." He left before the food arrived. He had ordered nothing, I realized. He had come only to deliver the envelope and go. That night I drove to New Haven. Orson had the USB connected within 30 seconds of my arrival. The encryption prompt appeared on his center screen, a plain dialog box asking for a password. He tried Cassian's name first, then the company name, then a combination of Alden's birth year and initials. Each time the box shook slightly and reset. I was sitting in the chair beside him. my hands in my lap, turning over the date in my mind. September 9th. The year she died, I was not certain of immediately. I had to reach back through what Alden had told me in pieces, in peripheral references, in the careful way he sometimes talked around a particular stretch of time. His first wife, Eleanor, had died in the autumn of 2003. I had not known her. I had only known the space she left behind. Try September 9th, 2003, I said. In the format, month, day, year, no separators. Orson typed it. A pause of less than 2 seconds. Every folder on the drive opened at once. He exhaled through his nose, a short, low sound. His eyes moved quickly across the screen, taking inventory, and something in the set of his shoulders changed as he read. He turned to look at me, and for someone as sparing with expression as Orson Vale, the look on his face said a very great deal. "You just unlocked an arsenal," he said. I looked at the screen. Folder after folder, each one labeled in Gideon's compressed accountant's handwriting. Wire transfers, email chains, report versions, shell entity correspondence. Enough, if handled correctly, to dismantle everything Cassian had built, not just the fraud, but the entire architecture of his plan. And then I thought about the password itself, about a man who had pledged his cufflinks and his dignity and his company to survive a debt he had dug himself, and whose father, all those years ago, had quietly placed white flowers on a desk and said nothing. Alden had loved Eleanor. He had also loved me. He was large enough for both and private enough to keep them separate. Cassian had spent 45 years in that man's orbit and had never once learned to look at him that carefully. Some secrets are kept out of love. Some are kept out of fear. In my experience, the ones that survive the longest are the ones that are both at once the secrets, where love and fear have grown so entangled over the years that the person carrying them can no longer tell where one ends and the other begins. Marlo Ashford had been carrying hers for over 4 decades. I drove to Westport on a Tuesday afternoon in early July when the Connecticut shoreline was thick with summer heat, and the trees along the post road were in full leaf, heavy and green. I had not called ahead. That was deliberate. I had learned in the weeks since this had all begun that people who were given time to prepare answers almost always prepare the wrong ones, the ones designed to protect themselves rather than to tell the truth. Marlo's house was a colonial on a quiet street 2 blocks from the water, well-maintained the garden. Tidy hydrangeas blooming blue along the front walk. The kind of house that said its owner valued order and permanence above almost everything else. She answered the door herself. 68 years old, silver-haired, wearing a pressed linen blouse, and the expression of a woman who had just found something unpleasant on her doorstep. When she saw me, the expression did not improve. Marceline. My name in her mouth had the same quality it always did, not quite hostile, but carrying the weight of a displeasure so old it had calcified into something permanent. "I wasn't expecting you." "I know," I said. "May I come in?" She did not move for a moment, her hand still on the doorframe. Her chin lifted with the particular stiffness of a woman deciding whether dignity required her to refuse. Then she stepped back. "I'll give you 10 minutes, she said. Her living room was exactly what I would have expected, formal, carefully arranged photographs on the mantelpiece that told the story of a life organized around family loyalty. I could see Eleanor in several of them, younger than I had imagined, with dark hair and Marlo's same determined jaw. Beautiful. I felt the familiar, complicated ache of looking at a woman I had never met, but whose absence had shaped so much of the life I had walked into. I sat in the chair Marlo indicated. She remained standing by the fireplace, arms crossed, watching me with the cautious energy of someone who expected to be asked for something they had already decided not to give. "I don't think we have anything to say to each other," she said, her voice clipped and cool. "Maybe not," I said. "But I think you might have something to say that matters more than either of us anticipated." I looked at her steadily. "I'm not here about Eleanor. I'm not here to ask you to like me or forgive Alden for moving on. I understand why you feel the way you feel, and I'm not going to argue with it." Something flickered in her expression, surprised maybe that I had not come to fight. "Then what do you want?" she asked, her voice slightly less armored than it had been 30 seconds ago. I held her gaze. "I want to ask you one question, just one, and I want you to consider before you answer what it means to protect someone who is using that protection to hurt people who don't deserve it." Marlowe's jaw tightened. Her arms pressed closer across her chest. "That's a very careful way of asking something," she said. "I've had a lot of practice being careful," I said. "Do you know who Cassian's biological father is?" The room did not change. The afternoon light still came through the shears in long, pale bars. The mantel clock still marked the seconds with its small, precise tick. But something shifted in Marlowe Ashford's face that I had never seen there before. A crack fine as a hairline fracture running through the composure she had been maintaining for longer than I had known her. Her arms dropped from her chest. Her right hand moved to grip the mantelpiece, and I saw her knuckles whiten as her fingers closed around the edge of it. Her eyes, which had been fixed on me with such careful control, suddenly filled, not with tears exactly, but with the bright, painful shine of someone pressing hard against something they have not let themselves feel in a very long time. "Where did you—" She started, then stopped herself, pressed her lips together so hard they went pale. "Who told you to ask me that?" "No one told me," I said quietly. "I've been watching your face for 6 years, Marlowe. Every time Cassian is in the room, you look at him differently than you look at anyone else who carries the Veil name. Not with love. With something else." I paused. "With guilt." A sound escaped her, then not quite a word, not quite a sob. She turned sharply toward the window, her shoulders pulling inward, as though she were bracing against a physical blow. Her free hand came up and pressed against her mouth, and I watched her chest heave once, with something she was fighting very hard to keep contained. "She was my sister's child," Marlowe said at last, her voice raw and unsteady, the careful diction gone. "Eleanor was everything to me. When she died, She stopped, drew a breath that shook on the way in. She made mistakes. We all make mistakes. I was not going to let her be defined by them after she was gone. "I understand that," I said, and I meant it. Marlowe turned back to face me. Her eyes were wet now, the brightness in them spilled over, and she looked older than she had at the door, older and more tired, like a woman who had been standing upright under something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally, in this moment, felt the weight of it fully. "She loved Alden," Marlowe said. Her voice had dropped to something barely above a murmur. "She loved him deeply. But there was a period a few years before Cassian was born when things between them were difficult. Alden was consumed by the company. Eleanor was lonely. She made a choice she spent the rest of her life regretting." She pressed her fingers to her eyes briefly, then lowered her hand. "When Cassian was born, we said nothing. Alden never asked. Perhaps he knew. Perhaps he chose not to. But we never spoke of it, and I have carried that in silence ever since." The afternoon stretched between us full of things that had been unsaid for 40 years. "I'm sorry," I said. "I'm sorry you've carried that alone." Marlowe looked at me, really, looked at me perhaps for the first time in 6 years, and in her face I saw something complicated and exhausted, and not entirely without a kind of reluctant recognition. She did not respond to what I had said, but she did not look away. I drove home through the long summer light, the sky still pale and warm above the tree line. I did not feel the satisfaction I had imagined I might feel when I finally found the missing piece. What I felt instead was something closer to grief for Eleanor, who had loved imperfectly and died young, for Alden, who had perhaps known and chosen silence, for Cassian, who had built his entire identity on a claim he did not know, was uncertain. This was not a weapon, not yet. It was a wound old and unhealed, and I had just pressed my hand against it. What happened next would determine whether it became something that helped the truth come out or simply caused more damage. I was not ready to decide that, but I would need to be soon. For 4 months, I had come to this room every single day. I had sat in the chair beside his bed and talked to him about small things mostly. The weather outside, what Mavis had made for dinner, a cardinal that had been coming to the feeder by the kitchen window every morning for 3 weeks. I talked because the nurses said familiar voices helped, and because the alternative sitting in silence beside the person I had built 9 years of my life with felt like something I was not prepared to accept. For 4 months, I had believed he could not hear me. I was wrong. Orson arrived at Hargrove on a Thursday afternoon carrying a small canvas bag that contained, among other things, a jeweler's loop, a set of precision tools, and a portable data extraction unit roughly the size of a paperback novel. He had come as my nephew. That was the simplest explanation for the nursing staff and the closest to accurate, given the complicated geography of how we were related. The room was quiet when we entered. The afternoon light came through the blinds in thin horizontal bars falling across the floor and the foot of Alden's bed. The machines beside him kept their patient rhythm. His hands rested open at his sides, and his face thinner now than it had been in March, the strong lines of it softened by months of stillness, was turned slightly toward the window, the way it always was in the afternoons. I positioned myself in my usual chair and held his hand, while Orson moved to the small table by the window. He examined the white lily arrangement I had noted in my journal 3 months earlier, touching nothing at first, only looking using the loop to examine the base of the stems where the artificial flowers were anchored into the foam. "There," he said quietly after about 90 seconds. He lifted one of the central stems and showed me without removing anything what was attached to its underside, a voice-activated recorder barely larger than a thumbnail matte black, adhered to the foam with a thin strip of mounting tape. The kind of device available at any professional electronics supplier. Inexpensive, extraordinarily effective. Voice-activated. Orson murmured more to himself than to me. It would only record when there was speech in the room. Battery life on a unit like this used intermittently could run 8 to 12 months. He looked at me. "Someone placed this here during the first days of Mr. Alden's admission. The early records show he had intermittent periods of alertness, in the first 72 hours enough time to give an instruction to someone he trusted." I thought of Mavis, of how she had been the first person allowed into that room after family, of how she had never once mentioned the vase. He extracted the device with careful hands, connected it to the portable unit, and began pulling the audio files. There were 11 recordings of varying length conversations between doctors and nurses, a few of my own visits, 2 occasions when Elowen had come alone, and one file time-stamped 3 weeks earlier that ran for 2 minutes and 14 seconds. Orson put in one earbud and handed me the other. He pressed play. The first sound was the door, the soft hydraulic click of the ICU room door opening and closing. Then footsteps, the particular measured cadence of a man who moved through spaces as though they already belonged to him. Then Cassian's voice. "You've made me wait long enough." His tone was low conversational, almost the way people speak when they are certain they cannot be overheard. "I used to think you'd wake up eventually and we'd have to have some kind of conversation about all of this. But honestly..." A pause, a sound that might have been him settling into the visitor's chair. "I don't need you to wake up. I don't need a conversation. I just need your signature. That's all you are to me right now, a signature." My fingers tightened around Alden's hand without my meaning them to. I could feel my jaw setting hard against the heat that was rising up through my chest. Not grief, not sadness, but something fiercer and rawer, the kind of anger that comes from hearing a person reduced to their usefulness by someone who owed them everything. The recording continued. Cassian spoke for another 40 seconds, logistics mostly the dispassionate language of a man running through a mental checklist. Then the sound of him standing, his footsteps moving toward the door. and then so quiet that Orson had to turn up the volume to be certain a sound from the direction of the bed, a breath. Not the regulated rhythm of the machines, a human breath drawn with effort from a chest that was fighting to do something it had not been asked to do in a very long time. And then a voice, thin as paper, rough with disuse, but unmistakably Alden Vale's voice. "I heard you." 2 words, barely above a whisper. The door had already closed. Cassian was already in the hallway, already gone, already certain he had spoken into emptiness. He had not. Orson pulled the earbud from his ear and set the device down on the table with the careful precision of someone handling something that has just become very important. He did not speak. He pressed his lips together and looked at the floor for a moment, and I saw his throat move. I set my earbud down and turned back to Alden. The machines kept their steady rhythm. His face was still eyes closed, hands resting open. I reached out and covered his right hand with both of mine. "Alden." My voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "I'm here." Nothing moved. The afternoon light shifted half a degree. Somewhere down the hallway, a cartwheel squeaked against the linoleum, and then his fingers slowly, with the concentrated effort of a man lifting something very heavy, closed around mine. Not a reflex, not a tremor, a grip. Deliberate, unmistakable, and warm in a way that made my eyes burn so sharply I had to press my free hand against my mouth for a moment to keep myself from making a sound that would have embarrassed us both. I looked at his face. His eyes were still closed, but the line of his mouth had changed a fraction, almost nothing, the smallest possible softening of the set of his jaw. "I will not let them take what you built," I told him. "I promise you that." His hand stayed around mine. Outside, the summer afternoon went on without us traffic on the street below, a helicopter crossing somewhere distant, the ordinary sounds of a world that had no idea what was happening in this room. I sat with him until the evening nurse came in for vitals, and then I sat a while longer. People overlook the staff. They always have. The woman who refills the coffee, who knows which drawer the spare keys live in, who has heard every argument through every closed door in a house for 15 years, she becomes part of the furniture, invisible by proximity. Cassian Vale had made that mistake from the moment he could walk, and he had never stopped making it. Mavis and I had been sharing the morning kitchen for 9 years. It was one of those arrangements that had evolved without either of us deciding it. I would come down early, she would already have the coffee going, and we would sit at the kitchen table for 20 or 30 minutes before the day began in earnest. We did not always talk about anything important. Sometimes we talked about the garden or the weather or a television program one of us had watched the night before. But in the months since Alden's stroke, those quiet mornings had become something else, a place where the things that could not be said in other rooms got said, carefully in low voices over cups that we refilled without thinking. That Tuesday morning in July, Mavis set a small Ziploc bag on the table between us before she even poured the coffee. Inside it was a USB drive and 2 keys on a plain ring. "I've been waiting for the right time to give you these," she said, sitting down across from me. Her hands wrapped around her mug, and I could see the slight tension in her knuckles, not fear exactly, but the braced quality of a person who's been carrying something longer than is comfortable. "I should have come to you sooner. I kept thinking I was overstepping." "You're not overstepping," I said. "Tell me." She told me about the night she had seen Cassian in Alden's study. It was more detailed than what she had given me on the phone in April. She had been holding back, then still uncertain. Now she walked me through it, precisely the sound of the side door at 11:47 at night, the light under the study door that had no business being on the way. She had moved down the hall in her socks and positioned herself at the gap where the door had not quite latched. "He was at the desk first," she said. "Then he went to the safe. He knew the combination. He went straight to it, no hesitation. He was in there for about 12 minutes. When he came out, he had a folder." She pressed her lips together briefly. "A red folder. Mr. Alden kept his insurance documents and the original property deeds in a red folder in that safe. I've seen it dozens of times. You watched all of that through the door gap, I said. I've worked in this house for 15 years, Mavis said, and there was a quiet dignity in her voice that I had always admired. I know every sound it makes. I know when something is wrong. She pushed the key ring toward me. Those are my copies of the study key and the side entrance. I had duplicates made when I first started here. Mr. Alden knew he approved it, in case of emergencies. I kept them in my room. She tapped the USB drive. The camera system in the house, the hallway cameras and the entrance cameras, I saw someone accessing the console in the utility room about a week after that night. I didn't know who had sent them or why, but I could see they were going through the archived footage. So I pulled the previous 3 weeks onto a drive first. She met my eyes directly. I don't know much about technology, Mrs. Vale, but I know that when someone is looking to erase something, you save it before they get the chance. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine for a moment. Her fingers were cold despite the warm mug. You did exactly right, I said. She nodded once and blinked hard, the particular blink of a person who's been holding emotion at arm's length and is choosing to continue doing so. I just want Mr. Alden to come home, she said. Her voice thinned on the last word in a way that told me how much she meant it. We sat with that for a moment, the two of us in the kitchen that still smelled like his morning coffee even after all these months. Then the back door banged open. Theo Vale came in, the way all 8-year-olds enter rooms at full speed with no announcement, his sneakers leaving faint grass marks on the tile. He was a dark-haired boy with Cassian's coloring, and I had always thought something of Alden's build already emerging in his shoulders, the broad, solid frame that came from good genes and would fill out in time. He had come with his father that morning, Cassian having arrived for one of his increasingly frequent visits that had nothing to do with affection and everything to do with maintaining the appearance of it. Theo spotted me and redirected without breaking stride, climbing up onto the chair beside me with the cheerful presumption of a child who had always been welcomed in this kitchen. "Hi, Grandma Marceline," he said, helping himself to a corner of the toast on my plate with the same presumption. I smiled and let him have it. "Good morning, Theo. How are you? Good." He chewed thoughtfully. Dad was on the phone really early this morning. He sounded mad. He reported this with the complete emotional neutrality of a child for whom parental phone calls were background noise. He said something about papers not being ready. "Did he?" I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. "Yeah." Theo swung his feet under the chair, looking out at the garden. Then, with the non-sequitur logic of childhood, he turned back to me. "Grandma, is Grandpa going to sign those papers Dad said Grandpa would sign them when he was sleeping? Did he sign them?" The kitchen went very still. I looked at this boy, 8 years old, toast crumbs on his chin, completely unaware that he had just handed me something more valuable than anything Rowan or Orson had found in 3 months of careful excavation. His face was open and curious and entirely innocent of everything it had just done. I reached over and smoothed the hair back from his forehead, the way I had done since he was small enough to sit in my lap without climbing. "Grandpa hasn't signed anything yet, sweetheart," I said. "Don't worry about that." Theo nodded, apparently satisfied, and slid off the chair to go investigate the garden. The door banged behind him. I looked at Mavis. She looked back at me. Neither of us said a word. We did not need to. I opened my journal to a fresh page and wrote in the neat, unhurried columns I had used for 22 years of records work. Date, time, location, speaker, exact words verbatim in quotation marks. Witness Theo Vale, age 8. A child had just said, without knowing what he was saying, exactly what Cassian had told his son would happen. And a child's unscripted words spoken in a kitchen with no reason to lie carried a weight that no coach testimony ever could. There is a particular kind of satisfaction that has nothing to do with revenge. It is quieter than that. It feels less like a fist hitting something and more like watching an old wall finally show the cracks that were always there, hidden beneath fresh plaster and careful paint. By the last week of July, Cassian's wall had begun to crack. Rowan called me on a Tuesday morning while I was standing at the kitchen window watching the hydrangeas Alden had planted the summer we moved in. They were blooming late this year, heavy-headed and lavender as if they were waiting for something. Vesper retained a divorce attorney, Rowan said. No preamble, no greeting. That was his way. Manhattan firm, Park Avenue address. She walked in 17 days ago, paid the consultation fee in cash. I set down my coffee mug with more care than the moment required. Cash. Which means she didn't want a paper trail back to the Greenwich accounts. His voice carried the flat, dry precision of a man who had spent 2 decades following money and had stopped being surprised by people. She's not leaving him because she stopped loving him, Mrs. Vale. She's leaving him because she's calculating whether the ship can still be saved, and she's decided it cannot. I looked at the hydrangeas. When did she make her appointment? 3 weeks before Gideon handed you the USB. So she knew the books were going to surface before Gideon ever sat down across from me in that quiet restaurant. Vesper had her own intelligence network, and she had already reached her conclusion before the rest of us had finished drawing our maps. "Thank you, Rowan," I said. "Keep watching." Orson called 2 hours later. He had been working through the email archive on Gideon's USB systematically folder by folder, and he had found something that did not belong to Gideon at all. "There's a forwarded email chain," Orson said. He sounded careful the way he always did when he was walking me through something that required precision. Dorian Blackwell sent it from his personal account to a firm in Hartford, not his firm, a different one. He's asking them to draft a personal liability waiver. The language is careful, but the intent is clear. He wants to be on record as having acted solely on client instructions. I sat down at my desk. He's building a firewall between himself and Cassian. That's the most charitable reading. Orson paused. The less charitable reading is that he already knows the case is going to court, and he's positioning himself to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for leniency. Dorian Blackwell had spent 20 years building a reputation as the attorney who always found a way through. Now, when the architecture of his own exposure was becoming visible, he was doing what every skilled attorney does when the client becomes a liability. He was choosing himself. I did not feel triumphant. I felt, if anything, tired in the specific way you feel when something you suspected for a long time is finally confirmed. Marlo called me that same evening. Her voice when I answered was different from the last time I had sat across from her in Westport. The edge was still there. Marlo Ashford had carried that edge for 40 years, and it had become a structural part of how she held herself upright. But beneath it, I heard something that sounded like exhaustion. "I need to see you," she said. "Not at my house. Somewhere quieter." We met at a small cafe on the Post Road an hour before closing. Marlo arrived first, which surprised me. She had chosen a corner table back to the wall, and she was already holding a cup of tea that had gone cold by the time I sat down. She did not wait for me to speak first. "I watched him last week," she said. "Cassian, at the hospital." She wrapped both hands around her cold cup. He stood at the door of Alden's room, and he looked at that man lying there, and there was nothing in his face. Not grief, not guilt, not even patience. Her jaw tightened. Just calculation. I waited. "I have spent 40 years protecting Eleanor's name," Marlo said. "Protecting what she did, why she did it, what she couldn't bring herself to tell anyone. I did it because she was gone and could not defend herself, and because I believed the truth would only cause suffering." She looked at me directly then, and her eyes were sharp and old and tired all at once. "But Cassian has gone further than I ever thought he would go, and I will not protect him any more." She reached into her coat pocket and placed a sealed envelope on the table between us. "Everything I know," she said, "written and signed. What you do with it is yours." I looked at the envelope. Then I looked at her. "Marlo," I said carefully, "I want to ask you something. When this is over, and it will be over, I won't use the question of his parentage to destroy him. I don't need to. What I need is the truth about what he did not, what he is. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite relief, more like the release of a breath held for a very long time. "That's all Eleanor ever wanted anyone to say," she said quietly. I drove home through the August dusk with 2 envelopes in my bag. Alden's sealed letter, which I had been carrying since June, without opening, and now Marlowe's testimony. 2 people who had never spoken directly to each other. 2 different kinds of secrets shaped by 2 different kinds of loyalty. And both of them in their own way had chosen to trust me with what they could not carry alone. I did not feel powerful. I felt the specific, unfamiliar weight of being trusted by people who had very few reasons to trust anyone. The hydrangeas would be gone by autumn, but what they had grown beside would still be standing. I was going to make certain of that. When a structure is about to fall, the outermost layer always peels away first, not from courage, not from conscience, from the very human instinct of self-preservation, arriving just late enough to look like regret. Sable Merritt texted me on a Wednesday morning through a signal number I had never seen before. 7 words: I need to speak with you. Alone. My chest tightened the way it does when something you have been waiting for finally announces itself. I typed back, "Name a time." She was already inside the small consultation room on the 2nd floor when I arrived, a narrow space used for patient family meetings with 2 chairs and a box of tissues on the table that had seen more grief than most rooms ever hold. Sable sat hunched forward, both hands pressed together between her knees, fingers interlocked so tightly the knuckles had gone pale. She looked like a woman who had not slept properly in weeks. Her eyes, when she raised them to meet mine, were swollen at the edges, the particular redness of someone who had been crying in private for a very long time. "Mrs. Vale," she said, and her voice cracked down the middle of my name. I sat across from her and folded my hands on the table. "I'm listening, Sable." She exhaled a shuddering, broken sound, and then she began. "He approached me in February," she said. "I was 3 months behind on my son's tuition. Cassian Vale walked up to me in the parking structure level 2, like he already knew my schedule, like he'd studied me." Her hands trembled visibly, fingers pressing harder against each other. "He said it was simple. Adjust 1 medication entry. Make sure the night shift log showed Mr. Vale was calm and responsive. $8,000, deposited in 4 days." My throat felt tight. "And you agreed." I was desperate. Her eyes filled so quickly the tears spilled before she could blink them back. "I knew it was wrong. I knew the moment I typed that code that I was crossing a line I couldn't uncross. But my son—" She pressed the back of her hand to her mouth, holding herself together by sheer force. "He needed that semester to graduate. I told myself it was just a number on a chart, that no one would get hurt." She reached into her bag and placed 2 items on the table, a folded sheet of paper and a thin envelope. "Screenshots," she said. "Cassian's messages from a burner account sent through Signal. I took them the night he paid me because I was terrified. I wanted a way out if things went wrong." Her voice dropped to almost nothing. "I left the coding error on purpose, as a trail, a breadcrumb back to myself in case I ever needed to come clean." My heart clenched so hard it nearly stopped, not from anger, but from the peculiar sadness of watching a person describe the architecture of their own fear. I reached across and gently pushed the tissue box toward her. "You did the right thing," I said quietly. "Coming here." "I did the wrong thing first," she whispered, and the tears ran freely now, tracing lines down her jaw that she didn't bother to wipe. "I just wanted to make sure it didn't also destroy someone who didn't deserve it." Rowan called 20 minutes after I left the hospital while I was still sitting in my car, with the engine off, pressing my fingertips to the bridge of my nose. Michelle Rowan received 3 separate payments. He said, voice carrying that flat, clipped precision I had come to rely on completely. Routed through a Venmo business account registered to a content consulting LLC. The LLC traces back to a Delaware entity, same filing agent as two of Cassian's shell companies. He paused one beat. Vesper was the operational contact. The LLC name is different, but the bank account linked to it has her personal signature on the opening documents. I closed my eyes. The payments were deleted. From Venmo's visible interface, the underlying bank records are intact. A subpoena will surface them inside 48 hours. I thanked him and ended the call. Then I sat for a moment longer looking at the dashboard, breathing in and out in measured counts, the way I had taught myself to do in the worst months of Alden's decline. 4 counts in, hold, 4 counts out. Then I drove to Hollis. His office smelled of old paper and cedar, the same as it had for 15 years. Hollis was already at his conference table when I arrived, sleeves rolled to the elbow, reading glasses pushed up into his silver hair. Spread before him were 8 labeled folders, arranged in 2 precise rows. I set Sable's screenshots and envelope on the table beside them. He picked them up, immediately scanned both sheets, and gave a single slow nod. "Rowan found the Venmo trail," I said. "Michelle's payments link back to Vesper." Hollis set the papers down with the deliberate care of a man who understood that what he was handling was no longer just a family dispute. He lifted one folder, then another, aligning them with the new materials. Dr. Selena's recording, Orson's digital logs, Gideon's USB, Sable's testimony, Mavis's footage and key copies, Marlowe's signed affidavit, Rowan's financial maps, the metadata report. When he was done, he looked up at me over the edge of his reading glasses. "Marceline," he said, and his voice carried the quiet gravity of a man who had practiced law for 40 years and did not use words carelessly. "We are ready." My eyes burned, not with tears, but with the sustained pressure of 5 months of holding everything in place through sheer will. I pressed my lips together firmly, jaw tight, refusing to let myself crumble. Not yet. I looked at the 8 folders on that table, each one a month of my life, a risk taken a person trusted, and for the first time since March, I exhaled completely. But as I reached for my coat, my hand brushed the inner pocket, the sealed envelope. Alden's handwriting, faded blue ink on cream paper, still unread. Hollis saw me pause. He said nothing, but his expression softened in the particular way of someone who understands that some things cannot be rushed. I needed to open it, before the hearing room, before the lawyers and the accusations, and the moment when everything we had built would either hold or shatter. Before any of that, I needed to hear Alden's voice one last time. There are nights before battles when sleep is not the question. The question is whether you are the same person you were when the fight began, and whether that matters. I sat in Alden's study at 11:47 in the evening with the desk lamp casting its familiar amber light across the surface he had worked at for 22 years. The room smelled of him, still cedar and old paper, and something faintly mineral like the Connecticut stone he used to say reminded him of honest work. I had not changed anything in this room since March. I told myself it was because it was his space. The truth was that walking in here required a particular kind of steadiness I had to prepare for each time. I took the envelope from my coat pocket and placed it on the desk in front of me. Alden's handwriting, blue ink, slightly uneven, the hand of a man whose grip had been weakening for a year without either of us saying so aloud. My name. Just that. Marceline. I opened it. Inside were 2 things, a folded letter and a small memory card in a paper sleeve. I read the letter first. His voice came through the page so completely that my throat ached before I reached the second paragraph. He wrote about the house, how he had always believed that a house reflects the intentions of the people who build it, and that ours had been built on intentions he was proud of. He wrote about Elowen, that she had her mother's precision and her grandmother's stubbornness, and that he had never once doubted who she was to him, not in 30 years, not for a single morning. He wrote that he had known about Cassian's financial maneuvering for longer than he had admitted to anyone, and that his failure had been not in seeing it, but in believing that love, The difficult, complicated love a man has for a child he raised regardless of blood could be held above consequence indefinitely. I was wrong about that, he wrote, and I am sorry I made you carry what I should have addressed myself. My jaw tightened so hard my teeth pressed together. I did not cry. I pressed my palm flat against the page and breathed until the burning behind my eyes subsided into something I could hold. Then I picked up the memory card. The laptop was already on the desk. I inserted the card, and the file opened immediately, a single video, 43 minutes long, date-stamped 3 weeks before his stroke. Alden sat in the same chair, upright jacket on hands folded on the desk in front of him. The man I knew still sharp-eyed and deliberate, his voice slower than it had once been, but absolutely clear. He looked directly into the camera. He said Marceline Vale had never deceived him, not once in 22 years of marriage, and that any documentation suggesting otherwise was fabricated. He said Elowen Vale was his biological daughter, that he had commissioned his own private DNA verification through a separate laboratory in 2019, and the result was unambiguous. He said Cassian had approached him twice in the previous year, asking him to restructure the trust in ways that would have transferred control before death. He had refused both times. He had documented both conversations with Hollis. He said if he was ever unable to speak for himself, this record was to be treated as his statement of intent. He said all of this in the tone of a man who had built things with his hands and understood that what holds a structure together is not sentiment, but precision. I watched the entire 43 minutes. When the video ended and the screen returned to the file manager, I sat very still. My phone rang at 12:31. Elowen. "Mom." Her voice was awake and tightly wound the way it gets when she has been holding something in for hours. "I know it's late, She exhaled a sharp, jagged sound. "I needed to hear your voice." "I know," I said. My own voice came out steadier than I expected. "Are we going to be okay tomorrow?" she asked, and the rawness in those 6 words, the years of uncertainty behind them, made my chest tighten to the point of pain. "Yes," I said, not as reassurance, as fact. She breathed. "I believe you." A pause, fragile and real. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too," I said. "Get some sleep." Hollis called at 1:15. 60 seconds. "Everything is in place," he said. "The arrangements have been made. He'll be present." A brief pause that carried the weight of something he did not need to elaborate. "Marceline, you've done the work. Tomorrow, you only have to walk in." I thanked him and ended the call. Then I ejected the memory card, held it between 2 fingers for a moment. This small, light, unremarkable thing that contained 43 minutes of a man telling the truth, and placed it in the inside pocket of my coat. I stood, turned off the desk lamp, stood in the dark for a moment with my hand still on the switch. Tomorrow, Cassian would walk into that room believing he was the one holding the final card. He would be carrying the DNA envelope like a weapon, certain it would be the last blow he needed. He did not know that the room itself had been built against him, piece by piece, month by month, by every person he had underestimated. I walked out of Alden's study and pulled the door gently closed behind me. The storm had already started. He just hadn't felt the rain yet. Cassian walked in at 9:03, 2 minutes late, with Dorian at his left shoulder and a leather portfolio tucked under his right arm. He was wearing a charcoal suit. I recognized the one he wore to Alden's company anniversary dinner 3 years ago, when he had given a toast about legacy and continuity that everyone had applauded. He looked, I thought, exactly like a man who had already written the ending. Vesper was not with him. I had not expected her to be. The room held 12 chairs around a long mahogany table. On our side, Hollis Elowen, Rowan Orson Doctor, Celine Carrick, and Marlo Ashford, who had arrived early and chosen the seat closest to the window. On the wall screen, a video call connection waited inactive for the moment Hollis would need it. I sat at the center of our side and folded my hands on the table and waited. Cassian opened without preamble. He unclipped the portfolio, removed a document, and slid copies to both sides of the table, with the practiced efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this entrance. "This is the amended will," he said. "Executed and notarized, naming me as executor and primary trustee of Vale Meridian Construction and all associated holdings. My father's signature, his attorney's certification, and a capacity assessment confirming he was of sound mind at the time of signing." His voice carried the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who believed he was reading from a script no one else had seen. Hollis let him finish. Then he reached into the folder at his right hand and placed a document on the table with the quiet precision of someone who had been waiting for exactly this moment. That document was notarized using a digital signature generated at 2:47 in the morning on the 19th of April. Hollis said, at which time Alden Vale had been administered a sedative by a night shift nurse and was medically incapable of executing any legal instrument. This, he tapped the paper in front of him, is the trust amendment Alden signed in my office 6 weeks before his hospitalization, witnessed, notarized, and filed with the Connecticut probate court on the date of execution. It is under Connecticut law the operative document. Cassian's jaw tightened. He looked at Dorian. Dorian was already looking at the copy in his hands with the expression of a man recalculating. Cassian set down the amended will and picked up a second envelope. "DNA results," he said. "Independent laboratory. Alawen Vale is not Alden Vale's biological daughter." He read the summary aloud, his voice recovering its steadiness, pressing the advantage he believed he still held. Hollis nodded once. Orson. Orson opened his laptop. The sample submitted to GenCore Diagnostics on March 22nd was taken without authorization from Alawen Vale's personal effects. Chain of custody is compromised, and the result is inadmissible. He turned the screen so the room could see the metadata. This is the collection log. The sample was submitted under a tracking code registered to a Vale Meridian corporate account, not a medical facility, not a licensed testing requester. He clicked once more. This is the result from Hargrove Medical Center's independent laboratory conducted with Alawen Vale's full written consent on a properly authorized sample. Paternity confirmed. 99.97% probability. The number landed in the room like something physical. Alawen beside me exhaled once a short, controlled breath, and her hand found mine under the table and held it. Cassian's color changed. It was not dramatic. It was the specific contained pallor of a man whose certainty has just developed a crack he cannot immediately account for. Orson pulled up the hospital log on the wall screen without being asked. The timestamp glowed in the center, 2:47:13 a.m., the digital signature field, the credential S. Merritt. Dr. Selene Carrick reached into her bag and placed a phone on the table. She pressed play. The recording was clear. Cassian's voice, then Dorian's, requesting she certify Alden's capacity on the 19th of April. Her refusal. The specific language Dorian used, just a formality, doctor. He was responsive this morning. Her response. His Glasgow score does not support that characterization. I won't sign it. The room was very quiet. Rowan read a 3-page financial summary in measured, precise language. The shell companies, the collateral, the $11.6 million, the falsified statements. On the wall screen, the video call connected Gideon Strake in a plain room that was not his office confirmed that the USB he had provided to Marceline Vale contained unaltered originals of the documents Rowan had just described. Then Marlowe stood. She did not look at Cassian when she spoke. She looked at the center of the table as if she were addressing something larger than the room. Eleanor Vale had an affair in the winter of 1979, she said. Her voice was old and steady and carried the weight of something that had been held a very long time. Cassian was born the following October. Alden raised him as his son because Eleanor asked him to and because he was that kind of man. But Cassian Vale has no biological claim to the Vale estate, and I am prepared to provide documentation, medical records, and my sworn affidavit to any court that requires it. She sat down. The window behind her showed a gray August sky. Hollis picked up the remote. The wall screen changed. Alden's study. Alden in his chair jacket on hands, folded. 3 weeks before the stroke that had taken his voice and left him behind glass in a room on the 3rd floor of Hargrove Medical Center. He spoke for 43 minutes. The room held every word. When the video ended, the silence was of a particular quality, not empty but full the way silence is when something irrevocable has just occurred, and everyone present understands it simultaneously. Cassian sat with both hands pressed flat against the edge of the table. His knuckles were white. His face had passed through several expressions and arrived at something I did not have a precise word for. Not grief, not anger, but the specific stillness of a man who has just watched the architecture of 5 months of planning come apart at every seam simultaneously without a single thing left to hold. Dorian cleared his throat. "I need to step out. I have a call." "Of course," Hollis said pleasantly. He did not move to stop him. The door opened before Dorian reached it. Inspector Nolan Pierce was a compact man in his mid-50s with the unhurried bearing of someone who had delivered difficult news many times and had stopped finding it remarkable. He stepped into the room, assessed it in a single glance, and walked to the near end of the table. He placed a single sheet of paper on the mahogany surface. He did not raise his voice. "Mr. Cassian Vale," he said, "we have a number of questions that require your cooperation." I watched Cassian look at that piece of paper. I watched his hand lift slightly from the table edge and then settle back down. I did not feel satisfaction. I felt, if anything, the particular exhaustion of a long wait finally set down, the kind that leaves your arms shaking slightly, not from weakness, but from the effort of having held on. Alden's face was still on the wall screen behind us, frozen on the final frame. He was looking directly into the camera as he had been for 43 minutes. He looked, I thought, like a man who had finally been heard. People ask me how I felt after everything. I tell them tired. It is the easiest answer, and it is not untrue. But the honest answer is something quieter than tired, something that settles low in the chest, like ballast finding its proper place after a long time at sea. The honest answer is light. Not happy, not triumphant, light. There is a difference that I think only makes sense to people who have spent a significant portion of their lives carrying something they could not put down. The legal process moved the way legal processes do, not quickly, not with any of the drama of the day it began, but with the steady grinding momentum of machinery that has been properly loaded and set in motion. I followed it through Hollis, who delivered each development with the measured precision of a man reading from a carefully annotated report. He was not without feeling, I knew that after 15 years, but he understood that what I needed from him was accuracy, not commentary. By the end of September, Cassian had been formally charged on 4 counts wire fraud forgery of illegal instrument obstruction of justice and breach of fiduciary duty in connection with the Vale Family Trust. The federal indictment ran to 41 pages. Inspector Pierce told Hollis in the dry tone of a man who had processed a great deal of paperwork that week that the financial evidence alone would have been sufficient to proceed. The rest simply ensured there was no viable exit. Dorian Blackwell surrendered his license to practice law in Connecticut on October 3rd. The Connecticut Statewide Grievance Committee's formal finding cited fabrication of supporting documentation and the coercion of a licensed medical professional. He did not contest the ruling. He had, I suspected, known for some time that contesting it would cost him more than conceding. Gideon Strake entered into a deferred prosecution agreement and became a cooperating witness for the federal prosecution. He looked when Hollis described their meeting like a man who had been holding his breath underwater for 2 years and had finally been allowed to surface. Vesper Vale filed for divorce in early October from a Manhattan address I did not recognize. She entered a separate cooperation arrangement with the prosecutor's office shortly afterward. She moved out of Greenwich before the leaves were fully down. I did not feel anything in particular about Vesper. She had made her calculations and arrived at the option that cost her the least. That was, I thought, entirely consistent with who she had always been. Alden woke on a Tuesday morning in the third week of September. Not all at once. It was never all at once. It was incremental, a gradual surfacing over several days, the way you watch something rise through deep water, visible before it is reachable. His eyes would open and then close. His grip would tighten briefly and then release. The nurses told me this was good. I chose to believe them entirely. And then one morning I came in at 7:15 before the shift changed, and his eyes were open and focused and looking at the door as I pushed it open. Looking at me specifically with the particular attention of a man who recognized what he was seeing. I sat down in the chair beside his bed, the same chair I had sat in for 6 months, the one with the slightly uneven leg that rocked faintly when I shifted my weight. I took his hand. His grip was weak but deliberate, intentional. He was choosing to hold on. He looked at me for a long moment in the way he had always looked at things he was working through carefully, as if the problem required his full attention before he would commit to a response. Then he said, in a voice that was thin and slow and unmistakably completely entirely his own, "Marcy." One word. 6 months of machinery and silence and rooms that smelled of antiseptic and old grief. And then one word, and it was my name said, in the voice I had been listening for since March. My throat closed so completely that I could not have spoken if I had tried. I pressed my lips together and nodded once firmly the way you nod at something that requires acknowledgement rather than response. I held his hand with both of mine. My eyes burned at the edges. I did not look away from him. "I'm here," I said when I could say anything at all. "I've been here the whole time." He closed his eyes, but his grip did not loosen. If anything, it tightened slightly, and I understood that to mean everything it needed to mean. Alawan received formal confirmation of her status as primary beneficiary of the Vale Family Trust on October 17th. Hollis called me at 3:30 that afternoon, and I could hear something in his voice that was as close to warmth as Hollis Wren permitted himself within a professional context, a slight softening at the edges, the verbal equivalent of a man allowing himself one moment of relief after a long effort. "It's done," he said. "The probate court has issued its order. The trust is hers." I was standing at Alden's desk when he called. Not sitting, standing, one hand resting on the surface as if I needed the contact with something solid. I thanked him and ended the call, and I stood there for a moment in the amber afternoon light with my hand on his desk, and I thought about Elowen at 27, inheriting not just the legal structure of a trust, but the knowledge that her father had protected her name, even when he could not protect himself. Then I noticed the drawer. The small one on the lower left, the one with the brass lock that I had a key for, had been holding the key for since the first week at the hospital on Alden's key ring without ever thinking to use it here. I unlocked it. The mechanism was smooth as if it had been used recently. Inside was a single envelope. White sealed the paper, slightly heavy. The handwriting on the front was Alden's, the same uneven blue ink I had come to know across 22 years of shopping lists and margin notes, and the letter he had left for me in Hollis's office slightly pressured at the downstrokes the hand of a man who had always held a pen as if the words mattered. The name on the front was Cassian. I held the envelope for a long time. I stood in that room where the light was going gold and the bookshelves held 40 years of a man's working life, and the smell of cedar had not changed since the day I moved in, and I thought about everything I knew, about the 43 minutes of video, about the trust amendment and the DNA report and the recording in the vase, and the 8 folders Hollis had arranged on his conference table. About Marlowe, who had carried a secret for 4 decades because she believed protection was the same thing as love. About Sable sitting hunched in that consultation room with her knuckles gone white saying, "I wanted a way out if things went wrong." And I thought about Alden, the complicated, careful, specific man who had raised a child that was not biologically his, who had loved that child in the difficult way that chosen love requires, and who had watched that child spend the last year of his healthy life dismantling everything they had built together. I thought about what he might have written. I drove to the hospital that evening. Alden was awake and more present than he had been in weeks, his eyes clearer, his attention steady, able to track a conversation for longer stretches before the fatigue pulled him under. I sat beside him. I placed the envelope on the blanket in front of him and smoothed the edge once gently. "I found this," I said, "in the locked drawer in your study." I looked at him directly. "I didn't open it. I don't think it's mine to read." He looked at the envelope for a long time without moving. His expression was the one I had come to associate with deep processing. Not blankness, but interior work, the face of a man traveling a long distance inside himself. Then he picked it up with both hands and held it against his chest, his eyes closing slowly, his breathing steady and quiet. I stood. I gathered my coat from the chair. I walked to the window. Outside, the maples along the hospital drive had reached full November, color-deep amber burnt orange, the specific red that only exists in Connecticut in late autumn when the season has exhausted itself completely and arrived at something stripped and honest. The kind of color that does not perform. It simply is what it is. I did not know what Alden had written to Cassian. I did not know whether Cassian would ever read it in a holding facility in a courtroom in whatever diminished life waited on the other side of the choices he had made. I did not know whether the words would reach him or whether he would have the capacity by then to receive them. What I knew was the worst thing that had happened to Cassian was not the indictment. It was not the loss of the trust or the exposure of the debt or the dissolution of the careful structure he had spent months constructing. The worst thing, the thing that would outlast all of that, was knowing that he had been loved, that Alden Vale had chosen him, had raised him, had held a name over him and called it his own for 45 years, and that Cassian himself had taken that love and used it as leverage, had looked at it and seen only an instrument, had spent the last year of his father's health trying to strip away what his father had built, rather than honoring what his father had given. That was not something a court could sentence, but it was, I thought, the truest consequence. I said goodnight to Alden. He did not open his eyes, but his hand moved slightly on the blanket, a small, deliberate shift, the closest thing to a wave that he could manage. I walked out into the November evening where the air was cold and clean and carrying the particular clarity that comes after something long and difficult has finally resolved. No pretense, no performance, just the air and the maples and the quiet end of a season that had asked everything of everyone it touched. I had done what I came to do. The rest belonged to someone else now. There is one thing I have never said aloud until now. In the darkest weeks when the smear articles were live, when Alden was silent in that hospital bed and I did not know if the truth would arrive in time, I prayed. Quietly in his study with the lamp on and the house too still, I did not ask God for victory. I asked for clarity, for the strength to do what was right without becoming someone I would not recognize afterward. I believe that prayer was answered. Not quickly, but answered. Here is what I learned, and I say this as someone who lived it. Family betrayal does not announce itself. It moves quietly in corridors and late-night whispers and paperwork you are not supposed to notice. I was nearly undone by family betrayal I did not see coming, not because I was foolish, but because I believed love was enough protection. It is not. Love without documentation, without attention, without courage, is just hope, dressed as a plan. So do not be like me. Do not wait for the crisis to understand who is truly beside you. Family revenge, the kind built on greed and entitlement, never creates anything. It only destroys what someone else spent a lifetime building. And family revenge always costs the one who pursues it far more than they expected to pay. My personal belief at 64, the truth does not need your help to survive. It only needs you not to bury it. If Marceline's story moved you, leave a comment, tell me which moment stayed with you longest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it and subscribe so you never miss what comes next.